The email landed in my inbox at 11:37 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I swear the ding it made was less a notification sound and more a tiny, satisfying thud of justice. The subject line was generic: Internal Staffing Update Counseling Division. But the first sentence? That's the one that made me lean back in my cheap, worn office chair, a smirk slowly stretching across my face, almost 3 inches wide. It read, "Effective immediately, Ken Davison will be reassigned from his current senior case manager role to a newly created administrative support position." Reassigned. That's corporate speak for demoted, stripped, and thrown back into the kiddie pool. It didn't mention me, John, not yet, but I knew what this meant. This wasn't just an update. This was the first ripple of a tidal wave I had been painstakingly, anonymously orchestrating for a solid month. I had taken his promotion, and now I had taken his peace. To understand why this email was the equivalent of a championship trophy for me, you have to rewind a little, back to when my life was just a loop of diligence and ignored potential. I had spent the last 3 years of my life pouring my soul into the Riverside Community Counseling Center. It's not some fancy corporate high-rise. It's a place where people who are genuinely struggling with things like addiction, trauma, and deep family issues come for help. It's heavy work, but it's meaningful. It's the kind of work that demands focus, empathy, and, most importantly, unwavering reliability. I love the work. I live the work. My office, if you could even call it that, was basically a glorified broom closet near the break room. It smelled faintly of stale coffee and desperation, but it was my outpost. I was the go-to guy for all the complex, messy cases that the other counselors, the ones who had been there longer, started to duck. If a client was non-compliant, if a file was a tangled mess of paperwork, or if the system suddenly crashed right before a critical audit, everyone, and I mean everyone from the front desk staff to the clinical director, shouted out one name: John. Where's John? Get John in here. I didn't mind. In fact, I thrived on it. I saw every extra hour, every salvaged case, every problem solved as a deposit into my promotion account. I was told explicitly that the next time the senior case manager role opened up, a position that came with a hefty salary bump, a proper windowed office, and the authority to supervise the junior staff, it was mine. My boss, Mark, had practically pinky sworn it. Mark Stevens was the kind of guy who thought leadership meant giving inspirational sounding speeches while doing absolutely zero actual work. He was all about appearances, big handshakes, and leaving exactly at 5 p.m. on the dot. He was the gatekeeper of the promotion, and for months leading up to the role becoming available, he'd been all smiles and vague compliments. "You're a crucial piece of the puzzle, John," or "Keep up the outstanding effort, and your patience will be rewarded, my friend." I was patient. I was reliable. I put my personal life on hold. I missed 2 weddings, 1 significant anniversary, and an emergency root canal because I was covering shifts or fixing some crisis that Mark had conveniently overlooked. I was the office engine, and I expected to be recognized for it. I was so sure of it that I actually started looking at new cars. Nothing flashy, just something that didn't smell like gym socks and regret. Then the email came through about the senior case manager opening. It was official. I meticulously prepared my application, and I spent a full week getting peer reviews and glowing client testimonials that were so strong they could have cracked concrete. I was ready. I was qualified. I was owed this. I was so convinced that I took my best shirt to the dry cleaners and laid out my promotion day outfit the night before the interview. I remember sitting in Mark's office, the air conditioning perpetually set to Arctic blast, trying to seem cool and collected. The interview was a formality. He didn't even ask me any tough questions. He just sat back, steepled his fingers, and nodded the entire time. "John," he said, leaning forward and using that overly intimate "we're buddies" now tone of his, "you're the heart of this office. You know the systems, you know the people, and frankly, you've been doing half the job already. You're precisely who we need to step up. Consider it done. Consider it done." Those 3 words hung in the air, tasting like victory and validation. I walked out of that office feeling 10 feet tall. I immediately called my mom to tell her the good news, that I was finally getting paid what I was worth. I stopped by the bakery and bought one of those ridiculously expensive mini cheesecakes to celebrate. But victory is a fickle mistress, and in the world of corporate politics, promises are just air unless they are in writing. The next day, I got a meeting invite at 4:30 p.m., titled simply, "Quick Follow-Up on Promotion." My stomach, which had been blissfully full of cheesecake, immediately started doing the tango of dread. I knew, with the cold certainty that only comes from knowing your boss is a spineless worm, that something was wrong. I walked into his office and the smile was gone. The "we're buddies now" tone was replaced by a sterile, formal drone. He was fiddling with a stress ball, avoiding eye contact like it was the plague. "John, have a seat. Look, I'm afraid there's been a change in direction." The classic line. The corporate equivalent of, "It's not you, it's me." He went on a long, rambling monologue about how the organization was moving in a slightly different strategic direction that required a fresh perspective and an external viewpoint to inject new energy into the role. It was all meaningless, management speak garbage designed to sound important while saying absolutely nothing. My blood was starting to simmer. "Mark," I interrupted, trying to keep my voice even, "what does that mean for the senior case manager position? The one you told me was mine yesterday?" He sighed dramatically as if I was the one making his life difficult. He looked me straight in the eye for the first time, and the lie was so practiced, so smooth it was almost impressive. "John, we've decided to bring in Ken Davison for the role. He's coming over from a similar practice on the East Coast. He has some unique contacts that we think will be invaluable for our community outreach, and he has a slightly different, more entrepreneurial background that we felt was a better fit right now." Ken Davison. I'd never heard the name in my life. An external hire. A fresh perspective. A better fit. All eyes. My hands were balled into fists under the desk. 3 years of my life, 3 years of going above and beyond, of covering for everyone, of fixing their screw-ups, and I was dismissed with a stress ball and a 5-minute monologue of convenient organizational rebranding. I didn't get angry right away, I just went numb. It was a deep, cold ache of betrayal. That numbness would soon give way to a focused, burning, strategic rage that Ken, Mark, and the entire office were about to meet head-on. Do me a favor and drop a comment right now. What's the biggest betrayal you've ever experienced at work or school? Tell me the time and place you're watching this video. The initial shock of the betrayal didn't last long, maybe 24 hours. It curdled quickly into a bitter, metallic taste of injustice that fueled me more effectively than any espresso shot ever could. My 3 years of grind, the missed life events, the meticulous problem solving, it wasn't just ignored, it was actively dismissed to make room for someone else. And the reason? A slightly different strategic direction. That phrase echoed in my head, a hollow shell of an excuse designed to protect Mark from having to say the truth. I gave the job to my friend. My office, the broom closet, remember, suddenly felt smaller, hotter, and utterly pointless. All the systems I had optimized, all the client relationships I had carefully nurtured, now felt like tools I had sharpened only for someone else to use. I was looking at 3 more years of the same, maybe even doing the new senior case manager's job for him, only without the title, the salary, or the windowed office. That was the truly crushing part of the grind. Realizing the only reward for hard work is often just more hard work. But then Mark called me into his office again. This time it wasn't to lie about strategic direction, it was to manage expectations. "Look, John," he said, leaning back in his chair, suddenly relaxed now that the heavy lifting of lying was over. "I know this is disappointing, but I need you to be professional. Ken is coming in next week and he's going to need your help to get up to speed. He's the new guy and you, John, are the cornerstone of our operation. You need to be his right-hand man." Right-hand man. Meaning, unpaid consultant and primary scapegoat should anything go wrong. The irony was thick enough to spread on toast. He was asking the person he had just thoroughly screwed over to train the person who screwed him over. And Mark said it with such casual entitlement, as if this was the natural order of the universe. I remember looking at his face, that self-satisfied, smooth-skinned complacency, and thinking, you have no idea who you just woke up. I gave him a non-committal nod, my face perfectly blank, the mask of the reliable employee firmly in place. "Of course, Mark," I said. "Whatever the office needs." But that's where the pretense of the reliable employee ended and the birth of the shadow operator began. I spent the weekend not sulking but strategizing. I didn't want to quit. Quitting would mean Mark won. Quitting would mean the injustice just fades away. I wanted Mark to pay, but more importantly, I wanted Ken to fail. And Ken had to fail in a way that was undeniable, documented, and, most importantly, attributed to his own incompetence. I started to reflect on those 3 years of grind. It wasn't just the cases, it was the systems. I had built little scripts and workflows to streamline my own workload. I knew exactly where all the confidential files were stored, I knew the IT network soft spots, and I knew how to navigate the internal performance review system better than the HR department did. I was an analyst by nature, and now my target was the very structure that had betrayed me. The office had this weird, endearing quirk. We used to have Wellness Wednesdays, where we'd all bring in different flavored teas and Mark would spend 30 minutes talking about mindfulness before rushing off to an early lunch. It was a small, relatable moment that solidified our connection as colleagues, even if the management was terrible. Those tiny connections with my colleagues, Sarah at the front desk, Ben the junior counselor, were the only things that kept me grounded. They were on my side not officially but through shared, exasperated glances every time Mark said something truly moronic. They were my unofficial silent jury. I even had my own quirk. I always kept a small black notebook which I called the error log. It started out innocently, just a way for me to keep track of system glitches and workflow snags so I could fix them later. But after Mark's betrayal, the error log took on a new, darker purpose. It became a detailed, meticulously documented record of every instance of management overreach, every dropped ball, and every broken promise. I wasn't just tracking errors, I was compiling a dossier of corporate negligence. I knew that absolute, undeniable proof was the only thing that could topple the Mark Ken fortress. No hearsay, no bitter complaints, only cold, hard data. The anxiety of what I was planning was a constant, low-grade hum in the background, a secret I carried like a lead weight. But the thought of just letting it go, of accepting the lie and training the usurper, was far more painful than the risk of exposure. My conscience was clear. I was not being malicious, I told myself. I was simply restoring the natural order of meritocracy. Ken was not qualified, and my actions would simply expose an injustice that was already baked into the system by Mark's favoritism. I started spending extra hours in my broom closet office again, but this time the grind was different. It wasn't for the center. It was for the reckoning. I dug into the anonymous reporting protocols. I studied the IT firewall. I found the perfect, untraceable external proxy server. I was building a ghost identity in the system, a shadow that could observe, document, and report without ever leaving a fingerprint. I was turning my expertise in system maintenance into a weapon of precision justice. And then Ken Davison walked in. I saw him for the first time on a Monday morning. He didn't sneak in. He strode in, carrying an expensive leather messenger bag and a smile that suggested he'd already won the lottery. He was tall, dressed in clothes that were just a little too casual for the office, designer jeans and an expensive watch, and he acted like he was the CEO's son showing up for his first day. Mark introduced him with a flourish, calling him an external talent disruptor, or some equally pretentious nonsense. Ken didn't even look at me when he shook my hand. He looked past me, over my shoulder, as if I were a piece of furniture he'd have to eventually move. "Hey John, right?" he drawled, his grip weak and dismissive. "Mark tells me you're the one who keeps the lights on around here. Good to have a reliable guy on the ground floor. I'll need you to walk me through all the client files, the system backups, and the quarterly reports. Like today. I've got a big meeting with Mark tomorrow." The sheer, unearned arrogance of it was breathtaking. He had the title, the window, and the salary, and he expected me to hand him the cheat sheet on a silver platter. I just nodded, the picture of professional compliance. But inside I wasn't just nodding. I was mentally tallying the first entry in a brand new targeted section of my error log. Ken Davison was officially on the clock, and the countdown had begun. I had gone from being the victim of this unfair system to being the meticulous, unseen auditor ready to bring it down. Ken's first 2 weeks as the senior case manager were exactly as disastrous as I'd secretly hoped, only magnified tenfold. He didn't just fail, he performed a masterclass in spectacular, entitled failure. And I, the reliable, loyal, and utterly betrayed John, was right there to help him fail better by doing exactly what I was told. Nothing more than the bare minimum, and only when directly asked. Mark's instruction to me was to bring Ken up to speed. Ken's interpretation was that I was his personal assistant. He'd saunter into my broom closet office, usually around 10 a.m. after his critical morning strategy sessions, which I strongly suspected were just long coffee breaks, and dump a pile of complex files onto my desk. "Okay, John," he'd say, gesturing vaguely, "these are the high-risk, non-compliant clients. You handle the follow-up, get them back on track, and then summarize their progress for me. Keep it concise. I need to present a success metric on this by Friday." He was delegating the hardest, most time-consuming part of the job, the part that actually required the empathy and expertise I had spent 3 years building, and demanding a summary so he could take the credit. This wasn't delegation, it was abdication of responsibility. I played the role of the diligent subordinate perfectly. "Absolutely, Ken. I'll make a note of this. Just one quick question. Since these are high-risk files, are you signing off on the immediate treatment plan adjustments, or should I just proceed with the standard protocol outlined in Procedure 4.3? Procedure 4.3 was a massive 80-page document I had practically memorized. It contained all the complicated legalistic nuances of our center's work. Ken, of course, had never read it. He'd just wave his hand dismissively. Just go with the flow, man. Don't overthink it. Use your best judgment. Use your best judgment. Excellent. I used my best judgment, which was to prioritize my actual existing workload, which he had just ignored, and let his high-risk files languish at the bottom of the pile. I was not being malicious. I was simply following the chain of command. My assigned tasks first, then his dumped tasks. My job description hadn't changed, only his title had. The emotional connection with my colleagues became my greatest asset during this time. I wasn't the only one suffering. Sarah, the wonderful no-nonsense front desk manager, was dealing with Ken's ridiculous requests for VIP client scheduling and his inability to remember any of the intake forms. Ben, the junior counselor, was getting contradictory and sometimes dangerous advice from Ken on how to handle crisis calls. We started exchanging looks, the kind of silent, meaningful communication that says, "Can you believe this absolute clown?" One afternoon, Sarah came into my office with a venti cup of my favorite coffee, a small, much-appreciated sensory detail that broke through the tension. "I'm going to lose it, John," she whispered, leaning against the door frame. "He just told me to file 3 months of sensitive intake forms into a shared Google Drive folder labeled Client Names. We are a counseling office. That's a HIPAA violation waiting to happen." I didn't react strongly. I simply pulled out my little black error log notebook. "Did you point out that our secure server is mandatory for all PII, per internal policy?" "Of course I did," he said, and I quote, "Just streamline it, Sarah. Nobody reads the paper copies anyway. He's going to get us all audited." I wrote down the exact time, the exact violation, potential HIPAA breach, and the exact quote, getting Sarah to initial the entry lightly just for internal accountability. This wasn't just bitter gossip. This was evidence collection. Every one of his lazy shortcuts, every dismissive wave of his hand, was another bullet point in my case against him. The layered conflict was deepening. It wasn't just Mark's betrayal. It was now the moral dilemma of watching Ken actively jeopardize the important work of the center with his incompetence. We handled vulnerable people, real people with real problems. Ken wasn't just being lazy, he was being negligent. That shifted my motivation from simple revenge to a genuine, if highly unorthodox, sense of corporate responsibility. I wasn't just fighting for my promotion anymore, I was fighting to protect the integrity of the counseling center. The turning point came at the end of Ken's second week. He was supposed to submit the weekly summary of high-risk cases to Dr. Helen Ramirez, the clinical director, who sat 2 levels above Mark and was legendary for her microscopic attention to detail. Ken, instead of getting the actual updates from me, tried to pull the data himself directly from the secure system, which he didn't understand. He ran a flawed SQL query, a complex computer language for database management that I had actually taught myself, that completely failed to filter correctly, resulting in a report that listed several highly sensitive cases as closed and successful, when in reality they were still active and struggling. He proudly attached this garbage report to an email and sent it off to Dr. Ramirez, blind copying Mark. I saw the email thread as it went out, and my heart simultaneously sank with dread for the clients and leaped with a thrilling, cold sense of opportunity. I immediately checked the actual, correct system status for the misreported cases. I took a full-screen screenshot of his flawed report, right next to a screenshot of the correct, current status in the secure database. The contrast was damning. It wasn't an oversight, it was a fabrication. Whether intentional or born of extreme laziness, it was a massive professional foul. I stayed late that Friday night, the office silence save for the hum of the old server rack. I logged onto the secure, untraceable external proxy I had set up. I composed an email to Dr. Ramirez, addressed simply from a concerned colleague, and titled it, "Urgent Discrepancy in Senior Case Manager's Weekly Report, for Immediate Clinical Review." The email was short, factual, and devoid of any emotional language. It didn't criticize Ken, it just presented the evidence. "Dr. Ramirez, please cross-reference the attached report from the SCM with the actual live data for the following 5 case IDs. The discrepancies may affect ongoing treatment planning." I attached the 2 screenshots, Ken's lie and the truth. I hit send. It was a dizzying, terrifying, exhilarating moment. The first anonymous performance report had been filed. The clock on Ken's peace and Mark's blissful ignorance was now ticking rapidly. I closed my laptop, walked out into the cool night air, and felt the exhilarating surge of a moral line crossed, not into the dark but into a necessary shade of gray. The moment I hit send on that first anonymous report, a subtle but palpable tremor ran through the office environment. I didn't know it then, but Dr. Ramirez was a hawk when it came to clinical integrity. She didn't just read the report, she acted on it immediately. By Monday morning, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that was less about the clients and more about the invisible eyes watching the management team. Ken, of course, was oblivious. He came in late, complaining loudly about traffic, and immediately demanded that Sarah fetch him a latte, acting as if the entire world revolved around his caffeine intake. But Mark was different. Mark had the harried look of a man who'd been called into an unscheduled, uncomfortable meeting with his own boss. His usual easy swagger was replaced by a rigid stiffness, and he kept disappearing into his office to take hushed phone calls. The official response came through on Tuesday morning in the form of a department-wide memo, cleverly disguised as a routine data integrity reminder. The memo stressed the critical importance of accurate reporting, specifically calling out the procedure for running SQL queries and referencing the precise data fields I knew Ken had messed up. It was a thinly veiled reprimand of the senior case manager role, a public yet anonymous slap on the wrist. Mark cornered me near the printer, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "John, are you having any trouble with the new data interface? Did you show Ken exactly how to pull the case success metrics?" I maintained the mask of the reliable employee, perfect in its sincerity. "No, Mark, no trouble at all. I showed Ken the basic query parameters, but honestly he said he had extensive experience with SQL on the East Coast, so I assumed he was fine. I offered to sit with him, but he declined, said he wanted to figure it out himself to master the system." That phrase, "master the system," was pure Ken, and it instantly diverted Mark's suspicion back to his friend's arrogance. It was a beautiful moment of psychological jujitsu. Mark bought it, hook, line, and sinker, because it confirmed his existing belief that Ken was perhaps too independent and talented for simple internal protocols. The lie was reinforced by its plausibility. But I knew one successful report wasn't enough. Mark's protection of Ken was built on years of friendship, not just a casual referral. I needed an overwhelming body of evidence, a pattern of undeniable, repetitive laziness. Ken was not just going to lose his job, he was going to discredit Mark's judgment entirely. This is where Ken's sheer entitlement provided me with rich material. Mark had given Ken the windowed office, remember? The one I should have had. Ken hated it. What? Because the sun hit the screen just right in the afternoon, making it difficult to stream soccer games on his personal laptop. So, instead of, closing the blinds, Ken decided the best solution was to simply start leaving the office for 2 to 3 hours every afternoon. He called them external outreach consultations. I noticed this pattern instantly. But more importantly, the front desk noticed. The junior counselors noticed. Sarah, my silent jury member, started getting calls for Ken around 2 p.m. every day. "Is Ken in?" a client would ask. Sarah would have to cover. He stepped away from his desk. "Can I take a message?" I installed a tiny, perfectly legal open-source script on my workstation that simply logged when the main office landline, which rang through to Ken's extension, was transferred to the main desk. It logged the time, the duration of the message, and the number of times it occurred daily. For 3 days, I collected data on Ken's chronic absenteeism during peak hours, the very hours when high-risk clients were most likely to call in for urgent support. On Thursday of that week, I filed the second report. Again from a concerned colleague, sent directly to Dr. Ramirez, and this time, also blind copied to the VP of Operations, a man named Mr. Thompson, known for his obsession with efficiency metrics. The subject line: time management discrepancies and impact on client accessibility. The body contained a polite, factual description. The senior case manager is consistently unavailable for client support and internal consultation during the 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. window. Attached are 3 days of call transfer logs showing repeated diversion of calls from his extension to the main desk, suggesting a critical lapse in coverage during periods requiring high-level intervention. I added a small sensory detail to make it real and relatable. I included a note. On Tuesday, a high-risk client, case ID, XXX, called in and had to leave a non-urgent but necessary message due to the SEM's absence. Timely communication in these situations is paramount. The effect of the second report was like dropping a small grenade into the center of the office. While the first report was about a technical error, which could be forgiven as a learning curve, the second was about personal conduct and client care. It was undeniable. It was logged by the phone system. It wasn't about what Ken did but about what he wasn't doing. The rising tension became palpable. Mark and Ken were now holding private, frantic meetings behind the closed door of the windowed office. I could hear their raised, frustrated voices occasionally leak through the thin walls. They were not talking about improving their workflow, they were talking about finding the source. Ken's response to the heat was not to work harder, but to become paranoid. He started scrutinizing every piece of paper on his desk, convinced someone was rifling through his files. He even accused Sarah of being intentionally slow with his latte order. His sense of unearned superiority was rapidly crumbling under the weight of his own documented laziness, replaced by an ugly, defensive suspicion. I meanwhile was the calm eye of the storm. I continued to be helpful, professional, and slightly confused by the suddenly tense atmosphere. When Ken asked me with a piercing accusatory stare if I had noticed anyone poking around his area, I simply shrugged and offered, "I've just been focused on the backlog of high-risk cases you assigned me, Ken. Seems like we have a lot of client needs right now." The fact that I was doing his job while simultaneously documenting his failure was the ultimate layer of irony and the source of my quiet, focused strength. I was setting up the pieces and they were walking right into the trap. The 3-year grind had taught me patience, and now that patience was being applied to a singular, precise act of corporate demolition. The first 2 reports had hurt Ken's standing. The next would be aimed squarely at the credibility of the person who hired him, my boss, Mark. The office environment, which had been tense, now became overtly hostile, specifically aimed at Mark and Ken. The anonymous reports had done their job. They hadn't just exposed Ken's failings, they had triggered an internal witch hunt that Mark was desperately trying to control. The second report, the one detailing Ken's daily absenteeism, had landed him in a mandatory disciplinary meeting with Dr. Ramirez and Mr. Thompson. The fallout was immediate and visible. Ken was forced to use an electronic clock-in/clock-out system, something previously reserved only for interns. He was fuming, slamming doors and glowering at everyone, convinced a coworker was spying on him. He was absolutely right, of course. Mark, realizing that his years-long friendship was costing him his own professional credibility, was panicking. His strategy shifted from covering for Ken to trying to find the leak, to stop the bleeding. "John," he called me into his office, the door dramatically shut this time. "I need you to look at something. I've asked IT to analyze the headers of those emails. They're anonymous, but they originated from within the building or at least through our VPN at the time they were sent. They're telling me it's hard to trace, but they are confident that this person is using one of the internal staff workstations." He was close. Too close. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, but I kept my face professional, even slightly sympathetic. This was the moment I had to become the best actor in the office. "That's serious, Mark," I said, leaning forward with a grave expression. "A security breach is the last thing we need. Do you want me to help IT? I've been maintaining these workstations for 3 years. I know the IP addresses and user profiles better than anyone." I offered my help because I knew that if I didn't, he might suspect me. By offering, I was putting myself in a position to steer the investigation away from my very specific, untraceable external proxy method. Mark, predictably, was relieved. He loved delegating problems he couldn't solve. "Yes, exactly, John. Work with Michael from IT. Just focus on finding any unusual login times or any secondary accounts. You know the system's quirks. This needs to stop, John. It's creating a toxic atmosphere." The irony was not lost on me. He created the toxic atmosphere by hiring his friend, and I was now being tasked with eliminating the evidence of his mistake. I agreed, walked out, and immediately began my counter-strategy. I didn't help IT find the anonymous sender. I helped IT confirm their lack of findings. When I sat down with Michael, a good-natured but slightly overworked IT guy, I deliberately focused his attention on low-priority security logs and external threats. "Look, Michael, I'm thinking about those spear phishing attempts from last month," I suggested, pointing at a completely unrelated log file. "Maybe this person compromised an account that way? Let's check the logs for any activity outside of normal business hours on the general shared workstations." Michael was happy for the direction. "Yeah, good point, John. Easier to hide on a shared account than a personal one." I knew this was a dead end. My reports were being generated outside of the internal network, encrypted, and then passed through an external server located hundreds of miles away, a secure channel I had set up months ago for personal project development. The reports only appeared to originate from within the building because of a tiny, deliberate technical artifact I had added to the metadata, a misleading digital breadcrumb designed to keep them hunting internally. But Ken, now paranoid and desperate, became his own worst enemy. The rising drama reached a crescendo when he tried to cover his tracks in the most ridiculously obvious way. Remember that HIPAA-violating shared Google Drive folder that Sarah was worried about? Ken decided to delete it. But he didn't stop there. In a moment of sheer panic, he went onto the secure internal server and tried to manually adjust the timestamps on several critical client files to make it look like they were updated while he was outreach consulting. He was trying to fabricate a timeline of diligence. The internal server, which I had helped set up, had an immutable multi-layered logging system that tracked every single file modification, including the old timestamp, the new timestamp, the user, and the workstation IP. Ken didn't know this. He thought deleting a log was the same as deleting a file. It was not. He just created a perfect, undeniable log of attempted file tampering, a gross violation of ethical and legal protocols. This was the jackpot. This was the moment I had been waiting for. This wasn't laziness. This was active, documented, potentially criminal deception. It wasn't just Ken's job on the line anymore, it was the center's reputation. I waited until I was absolutely sure Michael from IT was busy with a network upgrade. Then I accessed the server log. I isolated the exact log entries showing Ken's user ID modifying the timestamps on the sensitive client files and trying to delete the history. I took 6 full-page consecutive screenshots detailing the manipulation, complete with the date and time and Ken's user ID clearly visible. This evidence wasn't just a critique, it was an execution order. I crafted the third and final report. The subject line was chillingly simple: evidence of client data tampering and system integrity breach. I did not mince words. I stated, factually, that the senior case manager had engaged in activity suggesting a deliberate attempt to mislead management by falsifying client record timestamps. I attached the 6 screenshots, creating an overwhelming, irrefutable visual narrative of Ken's desperation and malfeasance. This report wasn't just sent to Dr. Ramirez and Mr. Thompson. For maximum impact, and because this was now a serious ethical breach, I sent it to an external auditor contact who specialized in nonprofit oversight, a professional relationship I had quietly nurtured for 2 years. The auditor was legally obligated to investigate any claim of financial or operational fraud concerning client welfare. The feeling as I pressed send this final time was no longer just fear or adrenaline. It was a deep, cold, settled sense of finality. The game was over. I had provided the prosecution with the case, the evidence, and the documentation. Now I just had to wait for the verdict. Ken had taken my promotion and now I had taken everything else. The explosion from the third report, the one detailing the data tampering, was not a sudden boom but a deafening silence. It didn't take place in the office hallways. It happened in high-level conference rooms and over secure, encrypted phone lines. The external auditor I had CC'd, a meticulous professional named Ms. Davies, took the report seriously. When client data integrity is threatened, the organization has to move with surgical speed to protect itself. On the Monday following the third report, Ken didn't show up to work. His chair sat empty, his expensive messenger bag was gone, and his desk was conspicuously clean. There was no memo, no announcement, just a gaping, immediate void where the senior case manager used to be. The silence was louder than any shouting match. Everyone in the office knew. They didn't know how or who, but they knew the lazy, entitled guy was gone, and that was enough for them to share a collective, sighing breath of relief. But Mark was visibly broken. He came in looking like he hadn't slept in days, his face pale and drawn. His boss, Dr. Ramirez and Mr. Thompson from operations, spent the entire morning in his office. The door closed, their voices a low, intense rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Mark's long-standing professional reputation, the very thing he prized more than competence or merit, was now in critical condition, flatlining on the cold tile of the counseling center. I watched him from my broom closet, maintaining my perfect posture of helpful diligence. Mark was the one who had made the promise, who had engineered the betrayal, and who had tried to cover the tracks of his unqualified friend. He hadn't just lost his friend's job. He was losing the trust and respect of his own superiors. His peace was shattered. The irony of the situation settled over me like a heavy velvet cloak. I, the reliable, loyal, betrayed employee, was now the one called upon to clean up the catastrophic mess left by the man who stole my job. Dr. Ramirez finally emerged from Mark's office, looking exhausted but focused. She walked straight past Mark, who was slumped in his chair looking defeated, and headed directly for my tiny corner. "John, I need to speak with you," she said, her voice quiet and direct. She didn't lead me to Mark's office. She led me to an empty, sanitized client counseling room, a neutral, secure space. We sat across from each other, separated by a tissue box and a stack of self-help pamphlets. "John," she began, dropping the usual corporate pleasantries, "I've reviewed the security logs from the last few weeks. The amount of system knowledge and client data insight required to flag the discrepancies we've seen, it's highly sophisticated. It suggests a deep, intimate knowledge of our systems and our protocols." My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. She was either going to praise me or fire me. I prepared my defense, a carefully crafted narrative about noticing anomalies during my regular system checks. She didn't wait for me to speak. She leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. "Mark hired Ken Davison based on a personal recommendation, bypassing our established merit-based hiring policy. He assured us that Ken possessed the necessary technical skills. It's now clear he did not. His lack of oversight and poor judgment have cost us a great deal of time, and worse, risked our clients' confidentiality. Mark is being put on mandatory, immediate administrative leave pending a full review of his management practices." I allowed my face to register a mixture of surprise and concern. "That's truly unfortunate, Dr. Ramirez. I'm sorry to hear that." She gave me a slight, knowing smile, a turning point that was less of a verbal shift and more of a psychological pivot. "John, over the past month, our internal review has confirmed every single item raised in a series of anonymous reports regarding the senior case manager's conduct. The flawed data query, the chronic absenteeism, and most recently, the attempted data manipulation." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "The person who filed those reports did so with meticulous detail, undeniable evidence, and a deep sense of commitment to the integrity of this center. That kind of rigor, John, doesn't come from a disgruntled employee. It comes from someone who genuinely cares about this organization and its clients." She never accused me. She never even hinted that she knew my identity. She simply gave credit to the person. This was her moral decision, her way of acknowledging the truth without initiating a self-destructive internal investigation that would have revealed Mark's full negligence and caused a PR disaster. "That person," she continued, "whoever they are, demonstrated an extraordinary level of attention to detail and a proactive approach to protecting our clients that, frankly, is precisely the kind of leadership we require in the senior case manager role." Then came the words I had been fighting for, the reward for the 3 years of grind, the month of meticulous revenge, and the constant fear of being exposed. "Effective immediately," Dr. Ramirez said, her voice firm, "I am restructuring the senior case manager role. It will now report directly to me, not to Mark, who is no longer in a position of authority. And based on your undisputed 3-year track record of diligence, your intimate knowledge of the systems, and yes, your recent unconventional contribution to maintaining the integrity of our client care." She took a breath. "I'm offering you the promotion, John. The title, the windowed office, the salary. It's yours." I didn't leap up or shout. I just sat there letting the words sink in. It wasn't Mark offering it with a condescending pat on the back. It wasn't the reward for blind obedience. It was the direct result of my strategic, necessary act of calculated defiance. It was a victory earned not through brown-nosing, but through the rigorous application of merit and documented fact. "Thank you, Dr. Ramirez," I said, my voice steady, the adrenaline of the last month finally giving way to a quiet, profound satisfaction. "I accept." The demotion of Ken had already happened. The demotion of Mark was happening now. My promotion was the final, satisfying twist in the saga. I had taken his promotion, and in doing so, I had taken his peace, and gained my own. The day I moved into the windowed office was less a celebration and more a quiet, profound moment of realignment. It wasn't just bigger, it had a view of the nearby park, a stretch of green that provided a calming contrast to the internal chaos I'd just navigated. My old broom closet felt a million miles away. I was now sitting in the very seat Ken Davison had occupied, but I hadn't taken his space through favoritism. I'd taken it through the rigorous, unforgiving application of undeniable proof. Dr. Ramirez, now my direct manager, was everything Mark wasn't. Sharp, focused, and obsessed with measurable results. She didn't just hand me the title, she handed me the key to a system-wide overhaul. The very first project she assigned me? Rewriting the internal security and data integrity protocols to prevent any recurrence of the tampering and negligence Ken had introduced. It was the perfect, full-circle assignment. I was being paid to institutionalize the very strategies I had used to expose the corruption. I called Sarah and Ben into my new office. They walked in tentatively, still accustomed to the oppressive silence of Mark's regime. I looked at their faces, the exhaustion and the silent loyalty that had carried me through the conflict. And I knew my first act of leadership had to be one of trust and validation. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what happened here," I said, closing the door. "You two were carrying the weight of Ken's job, and you saw exactly what was going on. I promise you this office is going to operate on merit and transparency from now on. Sarah, I need your expertise on client access and scheduling protocols. Ben, your clinical insight is invaluable. This is no longer Mark's operation, it's ours." Their visible relief was immediate. Sarah smiled, a genuine, wide smile that had been absent for months. "It feels like we can finally breathe, John." "Thank you." Ben just gave me a solid nod, the kind of quiet acknowledgement that meant everything. My silent jury was now my active support team. The twist wasn't just my promotion, it was the quiet, dignified fallout around Mark. He wasn't fired, not technically. He was placed on administrative leave, a corporate purgatory that amounted to a massive pay cut, a loss of all supervisory authority, and a complete stripping of his power. He was allowed to come into the office occasionally, but only to clear out his files, and he had to report to a manager 3 levels below his previous status. I ran into him one afternoon near the kitchen. He was holding a cardboard box filled with desk paraphernalia, a few framed photos, his old stress ball, and a sad-looking potted plant. His posture was defeated, his eyes empty. The Mark I remembered, loud, arrogant, full of false promises, was gone, replaced by a ghost of professional failure. He didn't offer a handshake, just a weak, defeated nod. "Congrats, John," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "You finally got what you wanted." I looked at him, not with malice, but with a clinical assessment of the consequences of his actions. He was looking at my new office, his old friend Ken's old office, and the pain of his poor judgment was etched on his face. "I got what the office needed, Mark," I corrected him, my voice calm but firm. The client care was being compromised. The integrity of the data was failing. I fixed it. He just sighed, a deep, heavy sound of a man recognizing the full extent of his mistake too late. "Yeah, well, be careful what you wish for. This job, it takes everything you have." He was trying to project his own failure onto me, but I didn't let him. "No, Mark. Laziness takes everything you have. Diligence creates opportunity." He didn't argue. He couldn't. He shuffled out the back door, carrying his box of diminished dreams. He had taken my promotion out of loyalty to a friend, and in return I had taken his peace, his reputation, and his authority. It was a trade-off I didn't feel guilty about for a second. The resolution of the story is found in the new equilibrium of the office. The processes are tighter. The data is secure. The high-risk clients are being managed by a team that cares, not by an absentee narcissist. I learned that in the corporate world, sometimes the only way to get justice is not to appeal to the good nature of management, but to provide them with an unignorable cost-benefit analysis. Mark's cost, reputation damage, risk of audit, exceeded the benefit of his friendship with Ken, and that's what ultimately led to my success. The lingering question I carry, even now as I look out over the park from my windowed office, is a moral one. Did I do the right thing? Was my calculated campaign of evidence-based demolition morally sound? I have to believe the answer is yes. I acted not out of petty spite, but out of a necessity to protect the vulnerable clients and the ethical core of the center. The means were unorthodox, anonymous reports and strategic misdirection, but the end was the restoration of meritocracy and integrity. Ken was demoted because he was incompetent and dishonest. Mark was sidelined because he was complicit. And I was promoted because, as the evidence I provided proved, I was the most qualified person for the job. I took Ken's peace, but I didn't take it to harm him. I took it to restore my own. And in the end, I found that the quiet satisfaction of documented victory far surpasses the temporary thrill of revenge. This new chapter isn't about fighting for my title. It's about earning it every single day with the diligence that brought me here. If you like this story about finding unconventional ways to earn your worth, drop a comment and let me know your favorite part, like this video, and subscribe for more stories of workplace justice.